All right, so in the interest of time, I'm going to get started with our next introduction of navigating government channels with Guillermo Rogel. So I'll just do a short introduction. So Guillermo is currently working for Front and Centered on the policy team, advancing state legislation and budgets that advance environmental justice and move our communities closer to a just transition.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and thank you all again for attending. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. Great. Okay. So here's just a really quick agenda of what we'll cover. I thought we were going to have time for introductions, but I don't think we will with 27 people. And I also have to leave at 11. I'm coaching a boys soccer team this fall. And they have one of their last games today. So I'm doing that right after. Yeah, it's not a winning team, but it's fun. But yeah, I did want to do just the name, pronouns, organization. And my introduction question would have been, do you have a favorite lawmaker, real or fake, alive or not, or a favorite campaign slogan? So maybe if you want to do that in the chat, that would be fun to see some of the answers. Mine, I think, might be maybe Claire Underwood. She's pretty cool. Okay. So where I really like to start these conversations is really grounded in our collective future. I mentioned at the beginning of the day that I really enjoy seeing these kinds of briefings because it gets to, we really get to see the fruit of our labor where the HEAL Act now became law. But we know that a lot of the best policies come from communities directly who are advocating for themselves and really pushing for change. So the road to change is often unpaved, which I tell a lot of advocates is that there is no one single structure to affect change in your community or at the state level. So it really is about making sure that you're grounded collectively in that. We also have to recognize that a lot of folks have different diverse tactics, their approaches, their messaging to reform or revolution. So we have to also acknowledge that is even in Front and Centered, we are a coalition of 70 member organizations. All of them come from different communities in Washington state who are trying to achieve, I would say we're trying to all achieve the same things, but their approach is different. So I think we just have to recognize that and respect that. Power lies with the people. We, the people, give institutions their power and their legitimacy. We can also take it away. So this is just from when I first started organizing in California, it was students really trying to push for a more affordable higher education system. And we always looked around and said, like, well, if no one advocates for us from the students' perspective, what's going to happen to our collective future? So we just want to make sure that we are grounded in that. So government channels, when Elise first reached out to me, I thought I had a clear idea of where I was going to take this presentation, but I really wanted to take a step back because me as an individual, I have had access to government institutions probably since I was like 18. Like, yeah, when I was like 18 years old, when I first started student organizing. And now that I'm 27, you know, I have like 9 years under my belt of working with the state legislature, either in California or Washington. But my level of access and my level of knowledge about government is not what people in Washington state might, you know, they probably haven't had that opportunity to access government the way that I have. So I just really wanted to take a step back in this presentation and focus on how everyday people in Washington state could start engaging. So I did want to mention that, you know, every day there are decisions that are made by state agencies, by government that affect the future of our communities, but it's not always known where those decisions are getting made, how they're getting made, and who are these people in positions of power. And a lot of time we tend to focus on federal government issues, I think because it is the most dramatic thing out there. It is on every news channel. You know, it typically, even when you watch local news, they seldom cover what the state government did. It usually goes to what DC did. But I just really wanted to emphasize that there are a lot of actions that local and state governments, county governments take that affect the day-to-day lives of people. It's not a government channel. It's not C-SPAN. So when I'm talking about government, I was looking for a solid definition of government channel. I didn't really find one. So, but I did find C-SPAN and TVW mentioned. But if you are interested in government channels, TVW is Washington C-SPAN. So if during the legislative session, you are trying to watch a committee hearing or a bill be debated, you'll probably get sent to TVW, which I think is a really good resource. They have really good coverage of state politics here in Washington. So when I talk about government channels here in Washington, here's more of what I mean. I mean institutions that have a decision-making process that are going to have an effect on our lives as Washingtonians. So there's the state legislature, which I am the most familiar with, along with the governor's office and government agencies. When you think about the three branches of government at the federal level, it is also here in Washington. So we have our court system, we have our legislative system, and we have the executive branch, which is the governor and their office. But then we also have the city councils in our communities, county councils, school boards, and of course, our congressional representatives and senators. So I wish I can give a training on how to access every single one of these, but I think I really wanted to give a high-level overview of what are some of the very first steps that you can take to start accessing these government channels. So where do you even start on accessing these things? First, I like to start by making sure that we are defining the difference between a problem versus an issue. Does anyone want to volunteer for what the difference might be between a problem and an issue? And I can't see hands, so maybe you can just unmute yourself. But does anyone want to give it a stab? Okay, I'll cover it. I don't know if someone did chat. Problem is little, issue is at large. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. The way I got introduced to this was that a problem can be specific to you, probably not to others. Like maybe a problem that you have might be that you're not a morning person. So it's like, how can that be fixed? Versus an issue is a problem that's shared by a collective. I bring this up because sometimes people face problems alone without recognizing the problem that they're facing is actually a systemic issue. It's something that a lot of folks in their community are experiencing, but they haven't talked about. You know, there could be, for example, at your workplace, maybe you think that you are being really underpaid. Maybe the benefits aren't what you want, and you don't really talk about it with your coworkers because it might be taboo, like in your work culture. But then you start having conversations with your coworkers and you're like, wait, we're all getting underpaid. We all are not having access to benefits. This is a larger systemic issue. You know, we should probably go into collective bargaining and do this and organize. So that's just one example of a difference between a problem and an issue. Where I would also start in accessing these government channels, and the reason why I started with a collective future is that before really reaching out to decision makers or getting involved in this decision-making process, it is super important to find out who is impacted and where are they. I think this is where the majority of organizing takes place, and it is the most important part of trying to address a systemic issue in any one of those government channels that I mentioned previously, whether it be your city council or your school board. You really have to make sure that you are centering the communities that are most impacted and reaching out to them. Second to that is who else should know about this? Who are the stakeholders? So there's this really deep planning process that happens within community or a group that is organizing to solve an issue, where you really have to map out who else besides us should know about this. Are there different nonprofit groups? Are there advocacy groups? Are there different communities who might be like tangentially impacted? So for example, if you are trying to organize farm workers, who are the big industrial companies who own these farm workers? who are probably going to have a say in the kinds of solutions that you're proposing. So whether the stakeholders are partners, people who might come out against your specific topic or issue, you just really have to know what that landscape is like as you're entering it. Any questions so far? Okay. This really goes back to the first question, is who should lead on this fight? And I think that should become clear at the very beginning, is it's frontline communities. If you are, for example, organizing farm workers, it should be farm workers who are leading on this. If there is an indigenous group that you are trying to ally with and help, it should be the indigenous community and tribes who are leading on the issue. Second to that is, who do you think are the decision makers responsible or accountable for your issue? Sometimes it's not always clear. I don't know if I mentioned this. Yeah. So it's not always clear who the decision maker is, but chances are, if you go to a decision maker who it's not their responsibility, like let's say you're going to a state legislator, when you probably should be checking in with your city council member, the state legislator will be very quick to say, that's not my jurisdiction, like that, I'm sorry that you're going through that, but you should probably go talk to your local city council member first. So they once you start asking the right questions, the people will help you find who you should really be talking to. What are some possible solutions to your issue? So you might try to brainstorm. For example, when I was organizing with students, we were 18, 19, 20 years old. We didn't have a firm understanding of how the state legislature influenced or funded our education. We didn't know really how the chancellors and the president's office worked on campus. But that shouldn't stop community members or groups from organizing. Because what I always tell people is that you don't have to have a specific identified solution to your problem. Because calling out the issue really is half the process. And there are a ton of people who will help. So for example, with the EJ Council and the Interagency Work Group, the Community Council are going to be community members with a deep lived experience in environmental justice, who have experienced environmental injustice, but will now have these technical experts, these folks from academia who are going to be on the council, helping folks understand the landscape and maybe possibly understand solutions, policy solutions that can help their community. So I wouldn't want folks to be really deterred or intimidated by how big their issue is, and then maybe how much funding is going to be needed to correct that issue, or maybe how long the policy is, or maybe what you're trying to fight for is a constitutional amendment, which is a lot of groundwork for a community member or a group to take on. But there are people out there who will want to help out. And then just a general understanding of timeline. Some of these solutions that are out there probably take one legislative session. Maybe it's a couple city council meetings that you want for a resolution for your council to pass. But every timeline is different. And I think it's folks who are organizing state agencies, for example, have to be honest with community about how long this is going to take. And in the breakout group that I was a part of right now, someone had mentioned, how can we make sure that we're compensating youth who might be participating in environmental justice movements? The community council that is going to be appointed by the governor's office, this is not a full-time job for them, but it very well will feel like a full-time job for a lot of these council members. So how can we make sure that we're compensating individuals? How can we make sure that we're giving resources back to community for their participation in these efforts? Any questions here? Okay. I'm going to go through, I'm just going to list them all right now, but there are a lot of different ways that folks can engage their city council members, these decision makers, how they can influence the narrative. So I just want to cover a few of these. Are just a few of the different ways that you could start accessing government channels. One is educating members. I host legislative training, like just a 101 about what is the state legislature, who are the players, like how is this process even doled out? Because sometimes that's what got me into this work. Is I attended a training where they were saying, this is what the state legislature is, and this is the impact that they have on your education. And something about it didn't really sit well with me. I was thinking, if I'm not there to advocate for myself, who is going to be there trying to propose these policy solutions? So even just basic education is one form of engagement, so folks understand the landscape. The other is empower those to take action. So if you are organizing community members to, let's say, call a state agency or the governor's office, get them to write phone calls from them personally so that they can have a personalized message to a decision maker, to an agency, to the legislature. Letters, a lot of people write emails. I really like to push for like physically handwritten letters, because a lot of folks don't do that nowadays, but it's really nice when a legislator is able to hear from a constituent, for example, and hear their personal story. Influencing elections is another way of navigating these folks. I think that goes back to, if you don't like how the table's set, like flip the table. And influencing elections is one of those ways where you can say, hey, like, you're not meeting our community's demands or our needs, so we're gonna try and run someone against you or actively work against you. That is another way of engaging in these channels. Lobbying elected officials. This is what I do directly with Front and Centered, is meet with state legislators or state agencies, even though they're not elected, and try to find out what's going on. What are they thinking about going into legislative session? Do they match our priorities or not? Can we count on them and on their support during a legislative session? And sometimes it's about basic education. A lot of these legislators don't know about environmental justice. They don't know about the community organizing that might be happening in their communities. So we just have to make sure that they understand that, and that we ask very direct questions. So in my job, it's a requirement for me to go in and have an ask. If I leave that meeting without asking a question, it's a waste of a meeting. We have to move the conversation forward. Testifying in committee is another form of lobbying. Disruptions. This is where I was talking about at the beginning, is that there are folks and organizations who have different methods of engagement, and sometimes their goal is to disrupt operations as normal. So that is another way of engaging. Influencing the narrative through media is some of the work that we also do, that I think is one of the more effective long-term ways of affecting change in government, is help people start talking about the issue differently. One of the things that we do at Front and Centered is there's a transportation package going on right now, and we want people to understand, like, let's not focus so much on cars, let's focus on people, and the people who don't drive or the people who can't drive. And that's one of the ways that we're just trying to shift the way that people even talk about transportation. And I think just an honorable mention is any statewide initiatives or referendum is another way of engaging government. Is if your bill, for example, didn't get passed during the legislative session, maybe you want to organize a statewide coalition to run an initiative. So Front and Centered was a part of a coalition in 2018 to push for 1631. That's your own way of creating legislation in community and just taking it directly to the ballot. I just wanted to cover really quickly the state legislature. Here in Washington, we have the Senate and the House. But for example, if you lived here in the 43rd legislative district, one of the first things is just finding out, hey, who's my representative and what's their contact information. So through the legislative website, you can go in, type your address. I think I typed in the address for the Front and Centered office, but our senator is Jamie Peterson with 2 representatives, Nicole Macri and Frank Chop. They will be the people who this community directly has to go out and influence and talk to. And this is just the state legislative process. There are for Seattle, there are a ton of decision makers that might be involved in the issue you're trying to solve. But as I mentioned, one of the first things that you just have to do is find out who your targets are, and what your collective message to them will be. And also, just all of these actions don't look the same. So here's an example of legislative session is organizing and messaging looks different on each of these steps. Whether you're over here to the left in bill introduction, or you're already to the floor vote, the obstacles are different. Not everything is super black and white in terms of what are the next steps. But there are people like Front and Centered, or organizations like Front and Centered, and individuals like myself who are there to help people understand this very weird process of passing a bill through the legislature. And as I said, you don't have to know everything about your policy solution to go through this really arduous process. So I think that might be my last slide. Yeah, so I'll stop there and probably take some questions, Elise and Sierra or Jacqueline. I'll turn it over to you.
All right, if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we can feed them over.
I've got a question. So you made really wonderful points, Guillermo, about first establishing a group of people who have a shared problem to make sure that it's an issue. Do you have any advice from your experience about that? I mean, a lot of us are at that stage. I mean, we know that we have the issue of all time, but specifically about reaching out to people and forming partnerships and coalition.
Yeah, I mean, I would find out, like, are there groups who are probably already working on this issue? Because they might have been around for a really long time and might help you skip a couple of steps. You know, like they might already have contact information for folks who are facing that problem, or they have the resources to help out. So one of the things I would do is find out locally, are there organizations that can help out in this? Or maybe even like if there are national groups like Sunrise, for example. Sunrise is a national, like, semi-autonomous movement with different chapters. There's like a Seattle chapter, there's a Bellingham chapter. So I think making sure to connect with them. But, you know, if those groups are not formed and your community members find yourself trying to tackle an issue that might be new that folks haven't thought about, you know, create the group itself, like start weekly meetings, and then someone will say like, wait, should we name this group? Like, should we have a name for like this like small little alliance that we have going here? So I'd say it takes some time, but I think as long as you're being very intentional and trying to check in with people on how they're feeling through that process, it'll kind of happen naturally. Like there is no book on how to follow these specific steps to create a movement.
Thank you, Guillermo.
So we have one question in the chat and then we'll get to Daniel. So how effective are letters to legislators? Are calls better / how many calls and letters are needed to be heard?
Yeah, it really depends on, and I hate saying that, but it really depends on the legislator. I think there are some who don't really care about their constituents and can really go on through their normal business with like checking their voicemails or checking their email. I think calls are really effective, but they can also harm your movement, because when their legislative assistant is just taking call after call after call or sending you to voicemail, they're just, it annoys them. And then like I have gotten emails before and they're like, hey, can you call your folks off? Like, I get it, you know? And then I'm like, okay, cool. Like, I'm glad that you get it. So I think folks really take time to read the letters that are sent to them a little more than calls though.
All right, Daniel.
I wanted to say, Guillermo, I really appreciate you talking engagement and then defining engagement, because I've used multiple times that people will use involvement interchanged with engagement. And people ask, well, what's the difference? And I like to use the example, if I ask you to take me to the grocery store and I come out, and whether I robbed the place or whether I went shopping, you're involved in that. But the engagement is that conscious effort to educate and to move forward together. And I really appreciate that. And I'm going to steal that example that you laid out. But thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, I think when I say, I think I mentioned at the beginning, talking about the HEAL Act, is as long as there's proactive measures, you know, that's the most effective way that you can engage community. And community knows when you're coming to them just to check off a box. That sentiment is there.
Exactly, and thank you, because that's a big mistake that a lot of bureaucracies make. It's just to check the box, get through, instead of, are we building relationship, creating relationship? So thank you.
Another question from the chat: is there a resource or list of legislators that are supportive of environmental justice?
Not an official list. Yeah, as front and centered, I will say, like, we're a C3 organization, so we don't engage in like endorsing people for specific things, but you know, there are champions. I would look at the bill sponsor list of Senate Bill 5141, which has a pretty good size of each folks who support EJ. But yeah, I think we could talk offline about that, and I can tell you yes or no.
Understood.
Yeah.
All right, there's a couple more minutes if anyone else has any questions they'd like.
I'm going to drop my email in the chat if you all would like to reach out to me to either set up something one-on-one or yeah, just talk. There was Eliza, I think was your name. Yeah, reach out to me because there are a couple youth groups I want to make sure that you're connected to that support front and centered work too.
Well, I would just like to say thank you so much for taking the time to educate us and speak with us, and really just get to the nitty-gritty details of the work that you do. And I think it's very helpful to see it broken down in the way that you did. And understanding those little bureaucratic, you know, routes you got to go through to get things done. And one thing that really stuck to me is just how important communication is. So talking to the people that are in your same field, so you're not repeating and sort of duplicating things, and that is a huge impediment to moving forward, and especially for the cause. So that's what happens when we all work together. More can get done.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much for having me, and yeah, I really appreciate being here. And thank you, Elise and Sierra, for reaching out.
And now it's time for a little self-care break. So, you know, get up, do some stretches. You can grab a snack. Maybe it's lunchtime for you. Go on a little walk, and we'll meet back at 11:30.